Gravity does not negotiate. It doesn't care about your stock portfolio, the names on your zoning permits, or the imported Italian marble you place on top of a geological fault line. You can buy the land, but you cannot buy the bedrock. I learned exactly how deeply some men misunderstand this fundamental reality on a windswept cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The wind off the coast tasted like salt and impending rain. It whipped around the collar of my heavy canvas jacket as I stood a mere 30 feet from a sheer 200-foot drop into the churning ocean below. I am in my late 50s, and for over 3 decades my entire professional life has been dedicated to listening to what the Earth has to say. You just have to know how to ask the right questions. Today my team was asking those questions with a massive diesel-powered rotary drill rig, punching deep into the coastal shelf of what was slated to be the most expensive piece of residential real estate in the state. "Pull it up," I shouted over the roar of the engine, signaling my lead driller. The machinery groaned, gears grinding as the winch hauled the hollow drill stem back to the surface. We were extracting core samples, long cylindrical tubes of soil and rock that provide a historical and structural timeline of the ground beneath our feet. For the past 2 weeks, my consulting firm had been contracted by Julian Sterling, a real estate developer whose ambition was matched only by his bank account. He was planning a $40 million mega mansion right here on the precipice, a cantilevered glass and steel architectural marvel that would literally hang over the ocean. The driller cracked open the steel casing and slid the core sample into a long wooden viewing tray. I pulled off my gloves and knelt in the mud, tracing my bare fingers over the raw earth. What I saw made the blood in my veins run cold. When you look at a coastal cliff, you want to see solid, unbroken igneous rock or densely packed sandstone. You want interlocking materials that hold together under immense vertical load. That is not what I was looking at. "Look at this striation," I murmured, pulling a magnifying loupe from my pocket. The top 10 feet were decent enough topsoil and packed dirt, but beneath that lay a thick, distinct band of Montmorillonite clay. Below the clay was fractured, highly weathered shale that angled sharply downward toward the ocean. In geology, we call this a slip plane. Montmorillonite is a highly expansive clay. When it is dry, it is hard as a rock. But when it absorbs water, say, from the heavy seasonal rains, this coast is famous for its swells massively and turns incredibly slick. It becomes a layer of industrial lubricant resting on top of a downward sloping ramp of fragile shale. "Arthur," my driller said, pointing to the sample. "That's a water table mark right above the clay layer." "I see it," I replied, standing up and wiping the grit from my hands. "The topsoil acts like a sponge. The water hits this clay layer, pools up, and lubricates the shale. If you put thousands of tons of concrete and steel on top of this, it's a giant surfboard," he finished quietly. I looked out at the majestic view, the very thing that made this plot of land worth millions. The earth beneath my boots wasn't a foundation. It was a loaded spring, just waiting for the right amount of weight and the right amount of rain to finally let go. I packed up my equipment with a heavy heart. I had to write the report, and Julian Sterling was not going to like it. Julian Sterling's downtown office was a monument to sterile wealth. It was entirely composed of floor-to-ceiling glass, polished chrome, and cold gray marble. It felt less like a workspace and more like an operating room designed to intimidate anyone who walked through the doors. Sterling sat behind a desk the size of a dining table, dressed in a bespoke suit that probably cost more than my drilling rig. He was a man used to the universe bending to his will. When I slid my 70-page topographical and geological stability report across the pristine glass of his desk, he didn't even open it. He just rested his manicured hands on the cover. "Give me the executive summary, Arthur," Sterling said, leaning back. "My architects are eager to pour the foundation." "You can't pour a foundation, Julian," I said, keeping my voice even. "Not here. The site is fundamentally unstable." Sterling's polite smile vanished. He tapped his index finger against the thick report. "Unstable? I paid $8 million for that acreage. I've already sunk $2 million into the architectural designs." "What do you mean, unstable?" "I mean the cliff is essentially a layer cake resting on a greased slope," I explained, leaning forward. "There is a massive seam of expansive clay resting on fractured shale. The dip of the rock layers angles straight into the ocean. If you build a $40 million estate on that cliff, the sheer load-bearing weight will compress the topsoil. Add the vibrations of heavy construction and the eventual water seepage from seasonal storms, the entire cliff face will experience catastrophic slope failure." "Catastrophic slope failure," Sterling repeated, rolling the words around in his mouth as if they were a foreign language. "Arthur, do you know how many times I've been told a project is impossible? They told me I couldn't build my tower in the financial district. I built it. Money and engineering can solve any problem. We'll just drive the friction piles deeper. Friction piles rely on the stability of the surrounding soil, I countered. You were trying to pin a structure to a geological formation that is actively trying to detach itself from the continent. I cannot and will not sign off on this site. It is not safe. Sterling narrowed his eyes. I hired you to give me solutions, Arthur, not roadblocks. You're a dirt doctor. Don't tell me how to build. I'm telling you that gravity doesn't care about your budget, I said firmly, standing up. My report is final. If you build there, it will fall. 2 weeks later, I was summoned back to the cliffside. The smell of the ocean was the same, but the atmosphere on the site had drastically shifted. Heavy earth-moving equipment was already parked near the property line, idling aggressively. Julian Sterling was waiting near the edge, the wind whipping his expensive coat. Beside him stood a young man who couldn't have been more than 28 years old. He wore brand-new work boots that lacked a single scuff of dirt, a tailored vest, and an arrogant smirk. "Arthur," Sterling said as I approached, "I want you to meet Marcus Tate. He's the new lead structural engineer on the project. He's from one of the top firms in the city." I shook the young man's hand. His grip was firm, practiced, entirely corporate. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Holmes," Tate said smoothly. "I've reviewed your geological survey. Fascinating data." "Then you understand why those bulldozers shouldn't be here," I replied bluntly. Tate chuckled, a condescending sound that immediately set my teeth on edge. He pulled a sleek tablet from his jacket. "Actually, I think your conclusions were a bit, overly conservative. We've run some digital modeling by implementing an aggressive soil nailing technique and utilizing a series of deep-rooted micropiles. We can effectively stitch the shale layers together. We'll also install a French drain system to divert the water away from the clay seam." I stared at him, genuinely appalled. "Soil nailing? Marcus, you're talking about putting band-aids on an arterial bleed. The slip plane is too deep. The sheer mass of the estate, the pool, the marble, the cantilevered wings will exceed the sheer strength of any micropiles you drive into that fractured rock. When the clay swells, it will snap those steel nails like dry twigs." "Our models show a high safety factor," Tate insisted, his smile tightening. "Models assume a static environment." I raised my voice over the crashing waves below. "This is a dynamic coastal cliff. The vibrations from driving those piles will only widen the microfractures in the shale." Sterling stepped between us, holding up a hand. "Enough. Arthur, Marcus has drafted a revised stability protocol. It incorporates your raw data but provides the engineering solutions required to move forward. The City Planning Commission needs a unified front. I need your signature on this joint report as the consulting geologist." He handed me a thick, freshly printed document. I looked at the title page. They had taken my empirical, hard-won data and twisted the conclusions to justify a death trap. Marcus Tate wasn't an engineer today. He was a highly paid enabler, brought him to tell the emperor his new clothes were magnificent. "Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm, "if I sign this, I am endorsing a fiction. I am telling the state that this land can hold the weight." "If you don't sign it," Sterling said, his eyes turning cold and hard, "I will find a geologist who will. And I will make sure everyone in the development industry knows that Arthur Holmes is an obstructionist dinosaur who stands in the way of progress." I looked down at the document. It felt heavy in my hands, not from the paper but from the sheer weight of the lie it contained. The revised report felt heavy in my hands, though it was merely a stack of paper. It held the dense, undeniable mass of a lie. I looked from the pristine white pages to Marcus Tate's smug face, and then to Julian Sterling, was watching me with the predatory stillness of a man accustomed to buying whatever he could not conquer. "Let's speak plainly, Arthur," Sterling said, stepping closer. The wind caught his expensive cashmere coat, making it snap like a sail. "I understand your firm has seen better days. You've got overhead, equipment, maintenance, payroll. This report, my version of the report, comes with a signature bonus. A secondary consulting fee for your continued expertise through the construction phase." He didn't pull out a checkbook. Men like Sterling never do anything so crass in the open air. But the number he casually dropped into the conversation was staggering. It was $500,000. Enough to upgrade my entire fleet of drilling rigs. Enough to ensure my crew was paid for the next 5 years, regardless of the market. I looked back down at the cliff edge. The ocean surged against the rocks below, a ceaseless rhythmic battering that had been carving this coastline for millennia. The Earth operates on a timeline that makes human ambition look like a spark in the dark. It doesn't care about consulting fees. You want to pay me to look the other way while you build a tomb, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline hammering in my chest. I am paying you to be a team player, Sterling corrected, his tone dropping an octave, the polite veneer beginning to crack. Marcus has provided the engineering solution. Your data remains intact in the appendix. We are simply adjusting the interpretation for the Planning Commission. Marcus, I said, turning to the young engineer, do you actually believe your micropiles will hold a $40 million structure when that clay swells? Tate shifted his weight, his eyes darting to Sterling for a fraction of a second before meeting mine. The digital models are within acceptable safety tolerances, Mr. Holmes. Engineering is about mitigating risk, not eliminating it entirely. That is a coward's answer, I told him quietly. I turned back to Sterling. I held the falsified report up, caught the edge of the thick binding, and tore it cleanly down the middle. Sterling's eyes widened in genuine shock as I let the two halves drop into the mud at my feet. You arrogant old fool, Sterling hissed, the mask entirely gone now. His face was flushed with sudden, violent anger. Do you have any idea what you've just done? I've set my boundary, I said. My original report stands. It has already been filed with the county clerk as a matter of public record. If you try to bury it, or if you build on this site, you are doing so with documented, premeditated negligence. Sterling took a step toward me, jabbing a manicured finger into my chest. You are off the site. You are fired. And I promise you, Arthur, by the time my lawyers are done with you, you won't be able to get a job drilling water wells in this state. I will bury your firm in litigation. I will make you a ghost in this industry. You can sue me into bankruptcy, Julian, I said, stepping back from his finger and turning toward my truck. But you cannot sue the bedrock. When that cliff gives way, I won't be the one standing on it. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet of nature. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of professional exile. Julian Sterling was a man of his word. Within 48 hours of my termination, the legal notices began arriving. Cease and desist orders, threats of defamation suits if I spoke to the press, and a mountain of frivolous injunctions designed to drain my firm's meager legal fund. But the lawsuits weren't the worst part. The worst part was the phone. It simply stopped ringing. Sterling had deep pockets and wide influence. Word circulated through the tight-knit community of developers and city planners that Arthur Holmes was uncooperative, outdated, and a liability to project timelines. In the world of high-stakes real estate, those words were a death sentence. Within 3 months, I had to lay off my entire drilling crew. I sold 2 of my rigs just to keep the lights on in my modest office and to pay the retaining fees for my attorney. For 6 months, I sat in forced isolation, watching the construction of Sterling's mega mansion from afar. I didn't need to be on the site to know what was happening. I followed the progress through drone footage posted by local real estate blogs and the triumphant press releases from Sterling's PR team. From the small window of my home office, which sat several miles down the coast, I could sometimes hear the deep, rhythmic thump-thump of the pile drivers echoing across the bay. Every time I heard that sound, a knot tightened in my stomach. I knew exactly what those massive steel pillars were doing. They were punching through the topsoil, tearing right through that slick band of Montmorillonite clay and hammering violently into the fragile, angled shale below. Marcus Tate's engineering solution was effectively shattering the very rock meant to anchor the estate. They weren't securing the cliff, they were tenderizing it. I spent my evenings drinking black coffee and staring at the copy of my original topographical map pinned to my wall. I checked the weather patterns daily. I tracked the structural load estimates of the steel beams being delivered to the site. I was a scientist in exile watching a grand, terrible experiment play out in real time, completely powerless to stop it. The financial strain was a dull, constant ache. My savings were dwindling, and the temptation to second-guess myself crept in during the darkest hours of the night. Maybe Tate's models were right, a small voice would whisper. Maybe engineering could outsmart gravity. Maybe I threw my entire life away for an abundance of caution. But then I would look at the core samples I had kept the fractured shale, the slick, expansive clay, and the doubt would vanish, replaced by a cold, dreadful certainty. The earth does not lie. It was only a matter of time. The breaking point arrived not with an earthquake, but with a whisper of low pressure moving in from the Pacific. In late November, exactly 8 months after I had been escorted off the cliffside, the seasonal rains hit the coast. They did not come as a gentle shower, but as a torrential, historic deluge. For 4 straight days, the sky poured an unrelenting gray sheet of water over the city. Local news stations ran continuous coverage of flooded intersections and mudslides in the foothills. I stood in my office, the rain lashing violently against the glass, staring at my whiteboard. I had been running the calculations since the storm began. The crown jewel, as Sterling had officially named the estate, was functionally complete. The $40 million structure was fully assembled, 3 stories of glass and steel, an infinity pool hanging over the abyss, and thousands of square feet of imported stone floors. The sheer dead load of the mansion was astronomical. I took a black marker and wrote down the current rainfall total, 14 inches in 96 hours. I drew a line to the soil absorption rate. The topsoil on Sterling's cliff was porous. It would be acting like a massive funnel, drawing millions of gallons of water directly down into the earth. And, waiting just beneath that topsoil, was the Montmorillonite clay. I did the math. The clay would be swelling at an exponential rate, expanding up to 3 times its dry volume. It was currently turning into a thick, pressurized layer of axle grease. The slip plan is fully lubricated, I thought, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. I looked at the date on my calendar. Today was the day. Despite the torrential rain finally breaking into a sullen, misty drizzle this morning, Julian Sterling was refusing to delay his grand unveiling. Today was the exclusive, invitation-only open house for the crown jewel. Buyers, investors, local politicians, and the architectural press were all scheduled to be standing on that cliff by noon. The timeline to failure had not just accelerated, it had evaporated. The microfractures in the shale were undoubtedly giving way right now under the combined weight of the mansion and the hydrostatic pressure of the swollen clay. I dropped the marker. It hit the floor with a sharp clatter. It was no longer a theoretical debate about long-term stability. The cliff was going to fail, and it was going to fail today, with 100 people standing inside a glass box balanced on the edge of the world. I didn't have a plan, only a terrifying certainty. I grabbed my keys, threw my heavy canvas coat over my shoulders, and drove toward the coast. The Pacific Coast Highway was slick with mud and debris from the 4-day deluge, but the sky had cleared into a deceptively beautiful, crisp blue. The contrast felt like a cruel joke. As I neared the property, the sheer audacity of Julian Sterling's vision came into view. The crown jewel was a monument to human arrogance. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern fortress of steel, glass, and white concrete, cantilevered perilously over the cliff edge. It looked as though it were defying gravity, suspended in thin air above the churning white-capped surf 200 feet below. A private, paved driveway snaked down toward the estate, currently lined with valets in crisp white shirts parking an endless stream of Bentley's Porsches and black SUVs, Porsches and black SUVs. I bypassed the valet stand, parking my battered Ford work truck half on the grass shoulder, ignoring the shouting attendant. I pushed my way past the perimeter security, flashing an old contractor badge they were too busy to scrutinize. The open house was in full swing. The expansive front courtyard, paved in imported travertine, was crowded with the city's elite. Waiters in black ties navigated the throng with silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played a lively Vivaldi piece near the edge of the infinity pool, which seemed to blend seamlessly with the ocean horizon. Through the massive glass walls of the ground floor, I could see Julian Sterling holding court. He was in his element, a bespoke king in his newly built castle, gesturing grandly to a captive audience of investors and architectural journalists. Next to him stood Marcus Tate, the young engineer, looking incredibly pleased with himself, sipping champagne. I stood at the edge of the travertine patio, ignoring the strange looks my muddy boots and canvas jacket were drawing from the tuxedoed guests. I wasn't looking at the architecture. I was looking at the ground. I was feeling the subtle, almost imperceptible vibrations traveling through the soles of my boots. I looked at the water level in the infinity pool. The water should have been perfectly level with the drainage grate on all 4 sides. It wasn't. The water on the ocean-facing side was lapping over the edge, while the water on the land-facing side was a full half-inch below the grate. The estate was no longer level. It was tilting. My eyes darted to the expansive glass facade. In a structure this rigid, any settling of the foundation would immediately transfer stress to the least flexible materials. The glass was taking the load. I pushed through the glass doors, the sound of the string quartet fading behind me as I entered the cavernous grand foyer. I needed to stop this event. I needed to get these people off the slip plane before gravity collected its invoice. Arthur! Julian Sterling's voice echoed sharply across the marble floor. He had spotted me. The polite murmuring of the investors died down as Sterling marched toward me, his face tight with barely suppressed fury. Marcus Tate trailed nervously behind him. "How the hell did you get past security?" Sterling hissed, keeping his voice low to avoid a scene, though his eyes were murderous. "You are trespassing." I will have you arrested and thrown in a cell. You need to evacuate this house, Julian, I said, my voice projecting clearly over the ambient noise. Several guests turned to look. You need to get everyone off this property right now. Tate let out a condescending scoff. Still playing the doomsday prophet, Mr. Holmes. As you can see, the house is standing. The micropiles are holding perfectly. The house is leaning, Marcus, I snapped, pointing toward the patio. Check the hydrostatic level in the pool. Check the tension on the load-bearing beams. The clay layer is fully saturated. It's failing as we speak. Sterling grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. Security! He bellowed. Two large men in dark suits immediately detached themselves from the walls and started moving toward us. You are a pathetic, bitter old man, Arthur. You couldn't handle being wrong, so you came here to ruin my moment. Bang. The sound was muffled, heavy, and incredibly deep, like a cannon firing miles underground. The vibration shot up through the Italian marble floor, vibrating the soles of my boots and rattling the crystal champagne flutes on a nearby catering table. The entire room went dead silent. The guests froze, looking around in confusion. What was that? An investor asked nervously. Just settling, Tate said quickly, though his face had gone completely pale. He looked down at the floor, his professional arrogance suddenly replaced by the raw, instinctual fear of prey. That wasn't settling, I said, my voice ringing out in the quiet room. That was the sound of a steel micropile snapping under sheer stress. Before Sterling could utter another word of denial, a second, sharper sound cracked through the air. It sounded like a rifle shot inside the living room. A jagged lightning bolt fracture suddenly materialized across a massive slab of the white marble floor, perfectly tracing the structural fault line beneath the foundation. Then came the groaning. It was a terrifying, low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was the sound of millions of pounds of structural steel twisting against its moorings. The cantilevered section of the house was pulling away from the bedrock, dragging the rest of the structure with it. "Get out!" I roared, pushing past Sterling and waving my arms at the paralyzed crowd. "Evacuate! Leave everything and get off the cliff! Now!" Panic, raw and instantaneous, infected the room. The elegant veneer of the party shattered. Guests dropped their glasses and scrambled toward the front doors. The string quartet outside stopped abruptly as the patio began to visibly slope downward. A woman screamed. One of the massive, custom floor-to-ceiling glass doors connecting the living room to the patio suddenly buckled under the immense torsional stress. The frame warped, and the tempered glass exploded into a million shimmering diamonds, showering the floor and sending a gust of cold ocean air roaring into the house. The slip plane had given way. The estate was in freefall, moving mere fractions of an inch per second, but gathering deadly momentum. Chaos erupted. Tuxedoed men and women in evening gowns shoved past each other, scrambling up the sloping floor toward the solid ground of the driveway. The earth below us was roaring now, a sustained, grinding rumble of fractured shale tearing away from the continental shelf. I stood by the shattered doorframe, grabbing people by the arms and hurling them toward the exit. "Keep moving. Don't look back. Run to the street." I turned back to the center of the room. Julian Sterling was standing exactly where I had left him. He was completely paralyzed, staring at the widening crack in the marble floor as if his brain simply refused to process the visual data. The monument to his ego was dying around him, and he couldn't comprehend it. Marcus Tate was nowhere to be seen. The young engineer had been the first one out the door. "Julian!" I yelled over the deafening groan of twisting steel. The ocean-facing half of the living room suddenly dropped 6 inches with a violent lurch. The grand piano positioned near the glass wall began to roll on its casters, picking up speed until it smashed through the remaining glass barrier and vanished into the open air. Sterling fell to his knees as the floor pitched sharply. I sprinted down the incline fighting gravity and grabbed the lapels of his cashmere coat. I hauled him to his feet. "Move, you idiot! It's going!" I dragged him up the steepening slope of the floor. The architectural joints were screaming. Drywall tore open, revealing the steel skeleton of the house warping under the impossible load. We reached the front doors just as the main supporting beam beneath the foyer let out a catastrophic, booming fracture. I shoved Sterling out onto the grass, diving after him just as the concrete threshold snapped off behind my heels. We scrambled up the lawn on our hands and knees, joining the terrified guests, huddled near the valet stand by the street. We turned back just in time to witness the climax of the disaster. The earth gave a final shuddering sigh. The entire front lawn, the travertine patio, and the $40 million structure separated completely from the coastline. For one surreal, suspended second, the massive estate seemed to float in the air. Then, the lubricated clay layer surrendered entirely. The crown jewel slid forward, detached from the cliff edge, and plummeted. Thousands of tons of glass, steel, marble, and concrete dropped in a terrifying, majestic freefall. 200 feet below, it hit the churning Pacific Ocean with an apocalyptic roar. A massive plume of displaced water and pulverized dust exploded into the air, soaring hundreds of feet high and raining fine gray silt over all of us. The ground beneath our feet shuddered violently with the impact, and then, slowly, the violent noise was swallowed by the rhythmic, indifferent crashing of the ocean waves. Where an architectural marvel had stood seconds before, there was now only a jagged, muddy wound in the earth, open to the sky. I looked over at Julian Sterling. He was on his knees in the mud, his expensive suit ruined, covered in gray dust. He was staring at the empty space above the ocean, his mouth open in a silent scream of absolute, unmitigated ruin. The laws of physics had foreclosed on his property. Gravity had collected its invoice in full. The aftermath of the collapse was a masterclass in modern panic. Within 10 minutes, the wail of emergency sirens drowned out the crashing of the ocean. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cruisers flooded the narrow coastal road, their flashing red and blue lights painting the stunned faces of the party guests in harsh, strobe-like flashes. Miraculously, there were no casualties. The warning groans of the failing steel had given us just enough time to clear the structure. Everyone was accounted for, though many were being treated for shock, wrapped in foil emergency blankets on the damp grass. I stood by my battered truck, watching a news helicopter circle overhead, its spotlight illuminating the massive, jagged crater where the $40 million estate had been just an hour before. Down below, the surf was already churning the wreckage, turning pristine glass and steel into expensive driftwood. I watched Julian Sterling from a distance. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by the frenetic, desperate energy of a cornered animal. He was pacing furiously near a paramedic unit, a cell phone glued to his ear. He was already spinning the narrative. He was probably blaming a freak seismic event, an act of God, an unforeseeable natural disaster. He would try to bury his negligence under an avalanche of legal obfuscation. Marcus Tate was sitting on the bumper of a fire engine, his head in his hands, trembling visibly. He wasn't arrogant anymore. He was a kid who had just realized that the math on his tablet translated into real, devastating consequences in the physical world. A sheriff's deputy approached me, a notepad in hand, asking for my statement. I gave him my name, my contact information, and a very brief summary of what I had witnessed. When he asked why I was at the party dressed in work clothes, I looked over at Julian Sterling. I was the original geologist on the project, I told the deputy, my voice carrying a quiet, heavy finality. I came to warn them that the cliff was failing. I didn't wait for Sterling to see me leave. I got into my truck, turned the ignition, and drove away from the flashing lights, knowing that the real shockwave was just beginning to travel. 2 weeks later, the dust had physically settled on the coastline, but the legal and political storm had reached a Category 5 hurricane. The collapse of the crown jewel was international news. It was the ultimate parable of billionaire hubris. But more importantly, the state wanted answers. A $40 million structure doesn't just fall into the ocean without someone signing off on a fatally flawed permit. The knock on my office door came early on a Tuesday morning. 2 investigators from the state attorney general's office stood on my threshold, wearing sharp suits and grim expressions. Mr. Holmes, we have a warrant to seize any and all documents, digital files, and communications related to the Sterling Coastal Project, the lead investigator said, flashing a badge. You don't need a warrant, I said, opening the door wide and gesturing to my conference table. Sitting in the center of the table was a neatly organized stack of manila folders. Everything is right there, I told them. You'll find my original topographical survey, the core sample data proving the existence of the Montmorillonite clay slip plain, and my initial report declaring the site structurally unbuildable. The investigator frowned, leafing through the files. Sterling's legal team provided a report with your name on it, approving the soil nailing technique. I walked over to my desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a large, clear evidence bag. Inside were the 2 torn halves of the altered report Julian Sterling had tried to force me to sign 8 months ago. You'll find that the signature on Sterling's version is forged, I explained calmly. I tore the revised report in half and refused his $500,000 bribe to look the other way. He fired me, blacklisted my firm, and hired Marcus Tate to rubber stamp the project. If you check Tate's bank records, you'll likely find a highly unusual consulting bonus paid out shortly before the City Planning Commission approved the build. The investigators stared at the torn report, realizing they were looking at the smoking gun of a massive criminal negligence case. They didn't just have a disaster anymore, they had a cover-up. Marcus Tate flipped yesterday, the second investigator murmured quietly, almost to himself. He's cooperating for immunity. This corroborates everything. I nodded. The truth had finally breached the surface. 6 months later, the air in the state capitol felt entirely different from the salty breeze of the coast. I sat in a high-backed leather chair in the governor's private office, a cup of untouched coffee resting on the mahogany desk between us. The morning papers were spread out across the desk. The headlines were definitive. Sterling indicted on 42 counters of freight and reckless indeterminants. Assets frozen in Mega Mansoner. Assets frozen in Mega Manson and collapsed. Julian Sterling was ruined. His firm was dismantled, his fortune tied up in a mountain of civil suits from investors, and he was facing serious prison time for falsifying engineering documents and bribing public officials. Gravity had taken his house, but the truth had taken everything else. The governor, a pragmatic woman with sharp eyes, folded her hands on her desk and looked at me. "I read the Attorney General's brief, Mr. Holmes," she said. "You threw your career away to stand by your data. You absorbed a massive financial hit, and you were completely vindicated. Moreover, your actions on the day of the collapse saved the lives of over 100 people. If you hadn't cleared that house when you did, we would be dealing with one of the worst mass casualty events in state history." I just read the rocks, Governor," I said simply. "They don't lie. We need people who read the rocks," she replied, leaning forward. "For too long, our zoning commissions and planning boards have been heavily influenced by developers with deep pockets. They treat environmental and geological reports as suggestions, not laws. That stops now." She slid a heavy, official-looking folder across the desk toward me. "The position of head geologist for the State Department of Natural Resources is currently vacant," she said. "I am appointing you to fill it. You will have final veto power over any major coastal or fault line development project in this state. No one builds anything without your office verifying the bedrock first." I looked at the folder, feeling the weight of the moment. After months of exile, of doubting my own sanity while watching a disaster unfold in slow motion, I wasn't just being welcomed back into the industry. I was being handed the shield to protect it. I reached out and placed my hand on the folder. "I accept, Governor. But you should know, I don't care how much money a developer has or how many politicians they know. If the ground isn't safe, the project dies." The governor smiled, a hard, satisfied expression. "That is exactly why you're getting the job, Arthur. I spent my life studying the earth, and the greatest lesson it ever taught me has nothing to do with dirt or stone. It's about truth. You can pour millions of dollars of concrete over a lie. You can hire the best lawyers to defend it, the best PR teams to dress it up, and the most pliable engineers to swear it's structurally sound. You can build a glittering monument to your own ego right on top of it. But a lie has no foundation. It is a slip plane waiting for the rain. When you are pressured to compromise your integrity, when someone tries to buy your silence or threaten you into altering the facts, remember that you are the bedrock. Short-term consequences, losing a job, facing intimidation, standing alone, can be terrifying. But they are nothing compared to the catastrophic collapse that eventually comes when you try to build a life or a career on a compromised foundation. Gravity always collects its invoice. Make sure you aren't standing on the edge when it does.